Well, hey there. I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Monday, January 31st. Here's some of what we're talking about tonight.
I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a person who sits down and talks to people and has conversations with them.
Actually, Joe Rogan is a person who has conversations that millions of people listen to. Now he is responding to artists pulling their music from Spotify over misinformation. But there's clearly an appetite for his kind of conversation, so what happens now? A judge has rejected plea deals for two men convicted of murdering Ahmaud Arbery. What will this mean for a third man facing federal hate crime charges? Also, some Olympians are packing a phone to use only in Beijing. The reason? Spying by the Chinese government. And it's time to plan your vote for this year's midterms. If you're in Texas, you only have a few hours left to register. A little behind the scenes for you. It is literally the first policy in our rule book here at NBC News. We are responsible for everything we report. If we say it, we own it. And the latest controversy involving Joe Rogan is largely about responsibility. Critics have accused him of spreading misinformation, especially about COVID. Now the criticism has evolved into a few high-profile boycotts. Spotify has exclusive rights to the podcast The Joe Rogan Experience. Some big names are pulling their content from the app, among them Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, and Nils Lofgren. Best-selling author Brene Brown has also stopped posting her podcast there, at least for now. Yesterday, Joe Rogan posted a video on Instagram, and he acknowledged that he needs to do more to balance his show.
My pledge to you is that I will do my best to try to balance out these more controversial viewpoints with other people's perspectives so we can maybe find a better point of view. I don't want to just show the contrary opinion to what the narrative is. I want to show all kinds of opinions.
But the issue for Mr. Rogan's critics is not just presenting various opinions, it's presenting valid ones. Opinions that are based entirely on facts. Spotify has responded to the boycott by adding content advisories to podcasts that discuss COVID. In a statement, Spotify's CEO noted that the app has removed more than 20,000 podcast episodes related to COVID. It's unclear which shows those episodes were from. NBC technology correspondent Jake Ward starts us off tonight. And Jake, I wonder what your sense is of the impact of some of these responses to Joe Rogan.
Well, they certainly, Joshua, have put Spotify in a difficult position, and the CEO is already doing what all CEOs at tech companies wind up doing in this position. You know, he's trying to basically acknowledge to his audience that there is a problem and that there is things within his control that he can change. He's saying that they're going to start, pushing more mainstream sources of information and hold a tighter line on this. But he's also not going to punish the guy that he is paying $100 million for the exclusive rights to his podcast. And so we're certainly seeing an impact here, but whether it'll have the kind of impact that actually involves Rogan going off the platform or capitulating, we don't know that part yet, Joshua.
Talk about that impact, because it feels like part of the impact that Joe Rogan has is not just the things that he says, but the people he amplifies and the way that technology, whether it's podcasts or YouTube videos, allows for the things that his guests say to kind of percolate through the internet with greater speed than perhaps corrections or fact checks could follow them.
Yeah, so, let me tell you a quick story from my own past that has always guided my thinking about this. So I was once the editor-in-chief of Popular Science magazine, and at that magazine, we discovered that people in the comments online were essentially contradicting the stories that we were writing. And some of these were extremely straightforward stories about, for instance, sexual health, the importance of using condoms to avoid STDs. And then we bumped into study after study that showed that people in their memories cannot tell the difference between what they read in the comments and what they read on the articles. And so so my very brilliant online director at that time came to me and said, you know what, I think we should take down our comments. And so we did. We did away with comments. At the time, we got beaten up, and I had to go on camera and on the radio and explain why we were, in the words of so many people, stifling free speech. And our argument was, we don't have the resources to responsibly patrol every comment that is made underneath our articles, but we do have an editorial responsibility to make sure that people are not getting misinformed about, for instance, how to protect themselves against STDs. And this is what I said at the time, and I can't believe I said this, Joshua, but I said, we need to push this instead to places that do have the resources to patrol their comments, and that's Twitter and Facebook. And how naive I was. So to watch, in this case, another CEO say, we don't want to censor anybody, while also having to somehow make good on having paid all this money to Joe Rogan. It's a very complicated situation. I get it, but it feels like it's definitely the road to misinformation, as you point out.
Well, and with regards to Joe Rogan himself, he put out an Instagram video over the weekend saying that he was going to take some more responsibility for the content that was on his podcast. Here's part of what he said.
I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a person who sits down and talks to people and has conversations with them. Do I get things wrong? Absolutely, I get things wrong, but I try to correct them. Whenever I get something wrong, I try to correct it because I'm interested in telling the truth. I'm interested in finding out what the truth is.
Jake, what's your sense of where this goes from here in terms of that relationship between Joe Rogan, the truth, his audience? Where does this go from here? Is Spotify putting these disclaimers on podcasts kind of the end of it, or is there more to it?
Well, this could go many ways, Joshua, right? You think about Netflix and Dave Chappelle. That wound up not being a problem for either Netflix or Dave Chappelle, although it was a big firestorm for a few days. There were no consequences handed out there. Here, we could see something similar. But there's also something new happening here in that Joe Rogan is taking the posture, hey, I'm just a guy who asks questions. I sit down and have these conversations. But this is a guy paid $100 million to do that. And so it's clear that people all over the world consider that to form some sort of responsibility on his part. Now, whether he will actually decide that he has a responsibility to try to keep people from being misinformed about COVID, not clear. And this is also, you have to remember, not a medium supported mostly by advertising. Most of Spotify's money comes from subscriptions. So unless artist after artist begins to pull from the catalog the way icons like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young have, well, that's really the only place it's going to hit Spotify's bottom line, Joshua.
NBC technology correspondent Jake Ward. Jake, thanks very much. Now, Joe Rogan may be one of the most listened to media personalities on the planet. It's hard to make an apples to apples comparison of songs to podcasts, but consider the reach of Spotify. Before Neil Young pulled his music, he reached about 6 million listeners there each month. Joni Mitchell reached about 3.7 million on Spotify. Meanwhile, the Joe Rogan Experience gets up to 11 million listeners per episode. And some episodes are 3 or 4 hours long. So what's behind his appeal? And how might he revise his approach to touchy topics? Let's continue now with Irshad Manji. Her books include Don't Label Me, an incredible conversation for divided times, and she is the founder of the Moral Courage College. I'm so glad you're with us tonight. Welcome.
Thank you, Joshua. Great to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you, and I wanted to talk to you about this because, complex and difficult conversations are right up your alley. I wonder, first of all, what your sense is of why Joe Rogan has so much appeal. He does have a large following, and he's had some standout interview moments, including when he interviewed Senator Bernie Sanders in 2019. Here's a piece of that interview. Watch.
Why do we have lobbyists? Why is it legal for someone to spend exorbitant amounts of money to affect our civilization, to affect the way our culture works?
All right, now you're taking us into a whole new area.
Yeah.
All right, let's look. All right, let me detour and I'll come back.
Please do.
All right. Today in America, you got 3 people owning more wealth than the bottom half of the American society.
The real problem seems to be that they have this strategy of unlimited growth. Not that they're not providing medication that people need to save their lives. I mean, it's obviously important to have pharmaceutical companies.
Of course.
Right. So there's good that they provide, but the business aspect of it is where the problem lies, right?
Right.
So moments like that, I think, Irshad, are one of the reasons why Joe Rogan has the following that he has.
Well, it's certainly one of the reasons. I think, though, Joshua, the biggest reason, and again, there are others, but the biggest reason is what might be called negative polarization. And what that means is when people take a side and feel passionately about it, not because they like their own side, but because they really hate the other side. And I think that is what applies in the case of Joe Rogan's appeal. People love the fact that he makes the establishment, quote unquote, squirm. They love that, he punctures their premises. And that doesn't mean that even most of his audience takes anything he says seriously. I'm not even so sure they give a damn about what he says in terms of his facts or lack thereof. I think what they care about more often than anything else is how angry he makes the people whom they want to see angry.
I wonder what you think in terms of the net effect of that. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong in a First Amendment, land of the free kind of a sense with people outside the mainstream skewering people in ivory towers or limestone or whatever this tower is made out of. You know what I'm saying? Like the idea inherently of someone who's outside of the mainstream, bringing contrasting, contrarian opinions can be good. So it seems like a Joe Rogan can have a useful function as long as the information is reliable.
Now, there you go again, Joshua, as long as the information is reliable.
I know.
And I hear why, as a journalist, you say that. The thing is, Joe Rogan is not a journalist. He does not claim to be a journalist. He's an entertainer. And boy, does he ever entertain. So in that sense, he, lives up to his mandate. When people accuse him of only falsifying information or spreading lies, or as I read in a newsletter from moveon.org today, that he's transphobic and a white supremacist, all of that is exactly the apoplexy that Rogan's audience loves to see, riled up in liberals and progressives. And they don't even mind if some of that apoplexy is shared by conservatives. They love Joe Rogan because of what he inflicts on the people whom his audience believes control the narrative.
One of the things he said in his Instagram video today is that he's going to do more work in terms of doing his research, getting his facts right whenever he has conversations about controversial topics. One of the conversations he had related to COVID went viral because his guest tried to fact check him in real time, and he resisted the fact checking until he kind of couldn't resist it anymore. Here's what happened.
For young boys in particular, there's an adverse risk associated with the vaccine. It's like a 2 to 4-fold increase in the instances of myocarditis.
Yes, but you know what?
Hospitalization.
You know that there's an increased risk of myocarditis among that age cohort from getting COVID as well, which exceeds the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine.
I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true. No. I don't think it's true that there's an increased risk of myocarditis from people catching COVID that are young versus increased risk of myocarditis from the vaccine.
No, there is. There's both.
Well, let's look that up, because I don't think that's true. Myocarditis is more common after COVID-19 infection than vaccination. But is this with children?
So sure enough, when he was fact-checked, he kind of resisted the fact-check. But I hear you, Irshad, in terms of Joe Rogan meeting the brief of what he purported to do. He never purported to be a journalist. He's only ever purported to basically be a talk show host, and he sort of met the brief. Before I have to let you go, I wonder what the path forward is with this. I do not like telling other people what they can say, because if there's room for me, there ought to be room for them. He hasn't claimed to be a journalist, and yet you have people like me and those of us who work for the Peacock who are tearing our hair out trying to be heard and just say, no, really, there are plenty of places to get good, reliable, factual information. Yeah. What do you see as the path forward, especially for those folks who like the skewering, who like the apoplexy, as you put it, that Joe Rogan can sometimes evoke?
May I be so bold, Joshua, as to suggest that I think that's the wrong question? Let me explain. The path forward is not really for Joe Rogan and his audience. The path forward that we need to talk about is for journalists like you, as you say, people who abide by the facts or strive to, and who are tearing your hair out to try and get heard. You know, the clip that you just ran of Rogan actually in real time getting fact-checked and then backing claimed is precisely one of the things that his audience loves about him, is that he's willing to go there. He's willing to be challenged in real time. And as a result, if he is found to be wrong, he will more often than not acknowledge it or go deeper for more nuance. And as somebody who does a 2 to 3 hour experience every day, he has that kind of time, whereas in a 3-minute segment, you don't. So here's the path forward for mainstream media who are not as trusted as Rogan is by his audience. Allow yourselves to be fact-checked in real time. See what happens. And if you have to say you're wrong, acknowledge it. Don't make it as difficult as passing an act of parliament. When you and your colleagues become as transparent as Rogan's audience believes he is, that may be when you start getting the audience that you believe you deserve.
I hear you on the transparency piece, and I think there's another conversation for another night about the work that you do and the way that we talk through those especially difficult, complicated cultural areas and bring transparency to that. But I do appreciate you talking us through this tonight, and I hear you in terms of transparency and how we do what we do. Irshad Manji, it's good to see you again. Thank you very much.
Hope to see you again soon, my friend. Thank you.
Before we move on, there was another big story today involving the words we use online, but just the 5-letter ones. The online guessing game Wordle has a new owner. The New York Times acquired the game. Selling price was in the low 7 figures. For those who aren't familiar, Wordle gives players 6 chances to guess a 5-letter word. Correct letters are highlighted yellow. Correct letters in the correct place are green. The Times says that Wordle's gameplay will remain the same and it will still be free for new and existing players. The game's creator, Josh Wardle, created Wordle, get it, Wordle, as a gift for his partner. Now, a lot of you shared your thoughts on this acquisition. John Jay tweeted, "Good for the developer. He made something for fun, people loved it, and he gets to benefit from that love." Quite a few of you were concerned about how the Times will keep the game free. Life's Too Short tweeted, "I was enjoying not having to see ads when I played. If the New York Times requires a subscription or makes you watch an ad, I'm out." Still ahead, a federal judge rejected a plea deal for the man who killed Ahmaud Arbery. That paves the way for a hate crimes trial next week. We'll get into reaction from Arbery's family and what a plea deal could have meant for the prosecution. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. There is an update in the prosecution of the men convicted of murdering Ahmaud Arbery. 2 years ago, Mr. Arbery, who was black, was chased by 3 white men and shot dead while jogging in a neighborhood in Georgia. All 3 men were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, one with the possibility of parole. Late yesterday in federal court, prosecutors filed proposed plea deals for 2 of the men. That surprise move would have averted a federal hate crimes trial that was set to start next month. Prosecutors offered the plea deals to Travis and Gregory McMichael. The deals called for 30 years in federal prison rather than the generally tougher conditions of state prison. But a few hours ago, a federal judge rejected the plea deals. In a statement, the family of Ahmaud Arbery made it clear they agreed with the judge's decision. Quote, "This proposed deal would have allowed the McMichaels to enter federal custody and serve the first 30 years of their sentence in a preferred federal prison. This plea was adamantly rejected by all members of the Arbery family," unquote. And here's what Ahmaud Arbery's father said outside the courthouse today.
He was killed racially, and we want 100% justice, not no half justice. I don't want them no chance to try to make their life easy. They're trying to stay in the state so they can be able to see their families and girlfriends and all that kind of stuff. When you're in prison, you need to be in prison.
Joining us now is Kristen Gibbons-Fedden, an MSNBC legal analyst and civil rights attorney, and she is also a former prosecutor. Ms. Fedden, can we just start with just a basic explanation of the difference between the state charges and the federal charges? Compare for us what we were dealing with in those two prosecutions.
Yeah, Joshua, in the state charges, they were dealing with the first-degree murder and the felony murder and really the acts of murder and the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. In the federal case, they're dealing with the murder, but more importantly, that the acts were motivated by some type of racial animus. That means by some type of hate crime, that they chased him down, cornered him, and ultimately murdered him because of his race. So that's kind of the main difference between the two trials.
Explain the impact of those federal hate crime charges. I mean, these men have already been convicted of murder. They are going to spend either their entire lives or a significant chunk thereof behind bars. What's the impact, the value of also pursuing hate crimes charges against them?
Well, I think in terms of incarceration time, it's a distinction without a difference. However, keep in mind, Joshua, that this was a murder that really affected the nation as a whole. And keep in mind that, Ms. Wanda Cooper, she fought from the start to allow even law enforcement to even give this case a chance. So I think it's a major difference in this particular case, because what Ahmaud Arbery's parents sought out was that, one, they wanted to make sure that their son was seen for who he was. He was a Black man, but he was a human being. But number two, to recognize their loss. And when we're talking about charges that are racially motivated and to have to show that these men acted out of hatred for his race, I think it is very significant for the victims in this case.
You mentioned Wanda Cooper Jones, Ahmaud Arbery's mother. Here is part of how she characterized the DOJ's move earlier today. Watch.
It's disrespectful. Yeah, I fought so hard to get these guys in state prison. And once I told them very, very adamantly that I wanted them to go to state prison and do their time that Judge Wansby gave them back on the 7th of January. Then I got up this morning and found out that they had accepted this ridiculous plea. Very disrespectful.
What do you think might have been the rationale for federal prosecutors to go ahead with a plea deal like this? Is there a strategic reason why they might have chosen to do this?
Sure. A guilty plea is always easier than a trial. Why? Because it's a guaranteed win. Yes, you don't have the amount of time. Yes, you're going to have to give up something. In this case, it was you give up a couple of charges and you give up an additional jail time, but you don't have the appellate issues that you generally have after a full-blown trial. So it's a conviction that is a lot more ironclad tight. But again, if it's not what the victim wants, the Federal Crime Victims' Rights Act does force prosecutors to make sure that those victims are heard and make sure that they know about every single condition and term of that plea agreement. So it's good that the judge heard the victims in this case and made their decision based thereupon.
You mentioned federal law in terms of hearing the victims. Could the prosecutors get in trouble for this? I mean, how much discretion do they have compared to what the Arbery family says it wants?
No, the prosecutors do have their discretion to offer whatever it is they think is appropriate, as long as they're not, violating any ethical laws. The victims do not have to approve of any plea deal. But generally, when you're talking about prosecutors and you're talking about a crime such as this, such as a murder, loss of a life, you really want to make sure that you have the buy-in of the family and make sure that they feel made whole. Otherwise, you're going to have a situation like this where they're objecting in open court and you risk having the whole plea deal go under, which is exactly what happened here today.
What's your sense of what all of this means going forward? I feel like the whole Ahmaud Arbery story was a story of a case that wasn't going to be pursued until someone leaked this video, and the whole world was like, you're not going to do any, you're just going to ignore this. And then the prosecution moved, laws changed in the state of Georgia, there were convictions. This feels almost of a piece with the story of the prosecution of Ahmaud Arbery's murder in terms of the push to make the system work all the way through?
Absolutely. And Joshua, I think it was so great that you showed the clip from his father and his father's statements. You know, the Arbery family, the parents, they made very clear this was about race. My son was running down the street. He deserved to run and jog just like everybody else. Was he found in that house? Sure. But there was so much footage, Joshua, throughout the state trial of other individuals who didn't have the same color skin, who were not Black individuals going in and out of those houses. And were they chased down? No, they weren't. And so to have evidence that is going to be made part of this federal trial that these men chased this boy down, but for his race, I think is very powerful for the parents. You know, justice is defined in different ways by different people. And I think that the Arbery family, based on the statements that have been reported, want the world to know that this was not a self-defense case. This was a case where three men decided they didn't want that little Black boy running in their neighborhood. And laws do not permit that type of misconduct.
Kristen Gibbons-Fedden, I appreciate you talking through this with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you live in Texas, you're almost out of time to register to vote in the primaries. Like, you got a few minutes left. Today is the deadline for Texans to register. We'll see how registration is going under the state's new rules just ahead. Stay close. Election laws are changing rapidly across the country. According to the Brennan Center, last year, 19 states enacted 34 laws that made voting harder, hence the renewed focus on voting rights, and you see the states there on your screen. Now, that means there's a lot to keep track of. Many states head to the polls on different days. Different states have different deadlines to register, and there are also new rules that you might not be aware of. Well, we want to do some of the hard work for you and help you plan your vote. And tonight, we begin with Texas in like the nick of time. Today is the last day for Texans to register for the March 1st primary. In December, a new voting law went into effect there. Among other things, it restricts early voting. It also requires either your social security number or driver license to mail in your ballot. And already, there are reports of mail-in ballot applications being rejected. Let's get into all of this with Phil Jankowski. He covers politics for the Dallas Morning News. Mr. Jankowski, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, Joshua.
What's your sense of how registration in Texas has been going under these new rules?
Not so great. This is the first election that the state has conducted under the new rules, and there have been lots of reports of people having difficulty trying to get their mail-in ballot applications in correctly. Voter registration hasn't been, well, it's had some issues as well. The Secretary of State's office has had refused to send out a lot of voter registration packets to organizations such as the League of Women Voters Texas, who are very nonpartisan and very much at the forefront of getting new citizens registered to vote. And they have refused to send their entire request, which sparked a lot of headlines that you might have seen. And then there's also just been, as I said before, many issues with people having problems with the new processes for getting an absentee ballot.
Yeah, I believe that the state justified that, truncated request for the League of Women Voters by saying that they were having problems getting the paper that they needed to print those applications. Is that right? Did that ever get resolved, or did they just kind of give up on meeting the size of the application request?
After a lot of pressure was put on them, frankly, from just the media reports, from people, reporting so-called supply chain issues that they reported, they have since sent several thousand voter packets to the League of Women Voters. It's unclear whether that entire issue has been resolved, but there have been people that have, there was a group of Southern Democrat members of Congress who volunteered to send reams of paper to the state of Texas to help out with this apparent supply chain issue that the Texas Secretary of State is having trouble finding reams of paper.
There are a number of different kinds of reports about people having trouble registering to vote or getting their voter registration updated, including a World War II veteran by the name of Kenneth Thompson. He spoke to our NBC station KPRC Channel 2 in Houston. Here's part of what Mr. Thompson had to say.
Per law, Thompson has to either provide his social security number or driver's license number that matches his registration record with the county or state.
That was because he registered to vote in the 1940s and they didn't require that.
Because he cannot add his driver's license information to his registration record to meet the new requirement, his mail-in ballot application was denied twice. And he says Harris County never notified him.
There's going to be a lot of people not going to vote.
What are some of the things that Texans need to keep in mind or have been trying to be extra careful about ahead of this voter registration deadline? Any common snags that are coming up that people are trying to avoid?
Yeah, the voter ID issue is the number one there, because your average person doesn't remember what number that they used to register to vote, whether it was their Texas ID number, most commonly a driver's license number, or their social security number. I don't remember what mine was. I'm not eligible to vote absentee, so it's not an issue for me, but I wouldn't know what number to put if I was eligible. There are people, as you showed in the story, there are people, he's not the only one that registered during a time when neither of those was present. And there are people that have lived in the same residence and not needed to update their registration for decades. So, requiring somebody to remember the number that they registered under is a really hard task for somebody to remember. Kind of also exacerbating that is that there are these election administrators feel like they're walking on eggshells when it comes to this new law, because there are criminal penalties attached to this new law that are related to what might be construed as soliciting a mail-in ballot. So they feel like their hands are tied in certain ways in helping cure these problems for folks that are seeing. So it's a twofold problem there, in that the people that have the answers to the questions feel like they cannot answer them, because if they do, they might be prosecuted and taken to jail.
Phil Jankowski from the Dallas Morning News. Be interesting to see how this turns out ultimately. We'll keep an eye on this, and we'd love to continue this conversation with you. Thank you very much for making time for us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Up next, it has been nearly 6 months since Afghans fled their country ahead of the Taliban takeover. We'll get into where they are now and the visa troubles some of them are facing when we come back. Afghanistan was on President Biden's mind today during an audience at the White House. He met with the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani. The Emir is now the first Gulf leader to meet with Joe Biden as president. They talked about a number of things, including a promise to make Qatar a major non-NATO ally. But here's what Mr. Biden said about Afghanistan.
This past year, our partnership with Qatar has been central to many of our most vital interests. Relocating tens of thousands of Afghans, maintaining stability in Gaza, and providing life-saving assistance to the Palestinians, keeping pressure on ISIS, and deterring threats across the Middle East, and a lot more.
Did you catch it? Qatar has helped with relocating Afghan refugees, and that continues to this day. It's been nearly 6 months since the U.S. military left Afghanistan, and since then we've watched the Afghan government collapse in real time. Afghans have desperately tried to leave the country. Tens of thousands have succeeded. About 76,000 Afghans have been brought to the U.S. since last summer. Most of them have moved into communities across the country. About 10,000 remain on military bases waiting for permanent homes. Another 2,500 are on U.S. bases abroad, including in Qatar. However, some need what's called a special immigrant visa. Those cover people like Afghan interpreters who risk their lives working for the U.S. According to the Wall Street Journal, about 60,000 of them, 60,000, are still in Afghanistan. The SIV program was set up more than a decade ago to take care of those who took care of American service members. Is it working the way it was intended to? Let's ask someone who helped design the special immigrant visa program. Tom Warwick was a senior official in the State and Homeland Security departments during the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations. Today, he's the director of the Future of the DHS project at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Warwick, welcome to the program.
Good evening, Joshua. Great to be here.
So let's start with that first question. How well or poorly is the SIV program working based on the way it was intended to work?
Well, so the number of people that we're bringing out of Afghanistan was larger and all at once compared with what we thought we were setting this up for almost a decade ago. The real challenge is that it's limited by how many people are checking applications. And this requires U.S. government officials, people in the military, to try to track down the history of some of these folks. Most of the people who apply for the program have clean records and they can be admitted without any problems. But there's a significant number that have what would be considered derogatory information. And what we've seen so far out of the statistics that DHS released, only about 88 people turned out to be really problematic. That's about 1 in 1,000. But there is a large number of people who need to be checked out. And you need to find out whether, for example, if they called a phone number in 2009 that's now found to be a Taliban leader, did the same person have that telephone in 2009? Or was it in fact that a U.S. Army officer directed the translator to try to see if they could broker a local truce or something like that? So there could be totally legitimate explanations.
That sounds like a tremendous amount of detective work, just one of the really complex ways in which a complex program like this has to operate. Let's talk about the other aspects of this SIV program. You wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post back in September. You wrote, "I helped design the SIV program. It needs an urgent update if we want to help Afghan refugees," or at least that was the headline of the article. Give me a sense of what that update might look like. It sounds like, at least in part, staffing is a big part of the update.
Yeah, so you need resources. You need people to be assigned to this project. And exactly as you say, Joshua, this is basic investigative work. It's not sexy or exciting, but it's got to be done to redeem American honor. The other problem we had was that when we set up the refugee program, being recognized as a refugee gets you an entire package of assistance programs. Someone will teach you English, someone will help you get a job, someone will help you learn how to live in an American city. When you let people in by what's called humanitarian parole, like many of these Afghans were, none of those benefits are automatic. And so Congress needs to do something like pass the Afghan Adjustment Act that would provide the kind of basic resources and permanent legal status that the country really owes these people who've risked their lives to work with the American military and journalists and aid organizations. So this is why many of us think American honor is on the line. We need to find a way of welcoming these people and taking care of them now that they're here.
I hear you in terms of restoring American honor by doing this program right. I wonder what you think about doing that through the SIV program or applying for humanitarian parole, which the Biden administration has encouraged some folks to do. Is one a better option than the other?
Well, humanitarian parole is really only a temporary status. This is a way that the law says that the government can decide, we'll let you in, but you're on your own. The Special Immigrant Visa Program came with the kind of benefits package that a refugee status gave, and it allowed for someone to have the resources to tide them over until they can get a job and become productive members of American society. We've done this in the past with other programs. We did this with people we took out of Vietnam in the 1970s, out of Iraq in the 1990s. So we know how to set these programs up. It just needs Congress to take a bipartisan step towards giving these people the kind of help that they're going to need. And experience teaches us that these people will end up becoming very valuable members of American society.
How much hope do you have for the SIV program now? You said that Congress needs to pass some legislation to move this along. We know how fast Congress moves these days, so I'm not sure if you're more optimistic or pessimistic about this program.
Well, the basics of the program have always enjoyed bipartisan support. People who really understand the importance of how our military works support this. People who understand how aid organizations work. There's a bipartisan understanding that this is something that we need to do. So this is one reason why Congress appropriated more than $7 billion in what I would consider record time this fall, so that the people came out starting in August, and by November, we had an appropriation that allowed money to resettle a lot of the people. I think we need to finish the job. And I think that means clearing up these visa backlogs. I think it means setting up the programs to integrate these people into American society. And so I'm actually optimistic that this is one of those things that Congress will get around to doing. It's just something that needs to have priority both from the Congress and from the administration, and one that's driven by the American people who understand the values that are at stake here.
Mr. Tom Warwick of the Atlantic Council, I appreciate you making time tonight, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joshua. Great to be here.
In Beijing, some Olympic athletes arrived with some new things in their luggage this year: disposable masks, disposable hand sanitizer, and a disposable phone. They call them burner phones. Cybersecurity in the Olympic Village. Before we go. How much data could be put at risk just by downloading an app? Well, depending on the app, it could threaten everything on your phone, even other apps. This could pose a real problem for Olympians. In order to participate in Beijing, the Chinese government is requiring everyone to download an app called My 2022. Athletes, journalists, spectators, everyone there must put this app on their phones. Don't search for it. Don't download it. Out of curiosity, because the watchdog group Citizen Lab has a warning for anyone who does. The group says that encrypted products could be sidestepped. Quote, health customs forms which transmit passport details, demographic information, and medical and travel history are also vulnerable, unquote. Now, the International Olympic Committee pushed back on these findings. It says that 2 independent cybersecurity companies vetted this app. That's not stopping other countries from telling their athletes to use disposable phones or burner phones. And of course, for the record, our parent company, NBC Universal, has exclusive U.S. rights to air the Olympics. Joining us now is Eric Noonan, the CEO and co-founder of Cybersheath Services International. He's a cybersecurity expert who has testified on Capitol Hill. Mr. Noonan, welcome.
Good evening, Joshua.
So what do you know about this app, My 2022? What does it claim to do? Is it like a social network, or what is it?
Well, it's very much as you described it, and it's alleged to facilitate the sharing of health information and to make it a safer games. But I think the way that you opened the segment, when you say how much data could be put at risk, I'd simply say all of it. So this is an app that is being forced on, as you correctly pointed out, journalists, athletes, trainers, everybody in country for the games. And so that means the population who's susceptible to surveillance, espionage, data theft, it's almost immeasurable, and it's unprecedented in the history of certainly the games.
How would they know if you downloaded it or not? I mean, I'm sure there are some who are going to say, yeah, I downloaded it. Yeah, sure, I got it. Got it right here. Got it right here. And then just try to get away from it. I mean, are they going to check everybody's phones for the traffic from this app?
So as we've seen with other efforts within China and their ability to control a population, I think they can make life very inconvenient. So what the IOC has said is that you don't actually have to download the app. You can simply go to a website instead. But think about the inconvenience of that. If you're somewhere in a long line and you don't have the app, and you don't have the ability to quickly get to a website, So if you are going to go to a website, you're probably going to do it from your mobile device. So while the website may be, a way to soften the potential impact, it still opens you to a threat vector of having your data stolen. So is there a way to enforce everybody to download it? Probably not. But if the Chinese want to get the data, they're going to get the data.
Walk me through what happens if indeed they get this data. I mean, what do you think that the Chinese government would be doing with it?
Well, the potential use cases for espionage, surveillance, data theft are nearly endless. So if we look many years ago, we know that China was behind the Office of Personnel Management hack many years ago. They were behind the Equifax hack. So if we think at first glance, the average citizen might say, well, it's just athletes. How much data are we really worried about here? But who you're calling, who you're texting, what you're texting, potentially what you're calling and talking about. And so we look at countries like Israel and the Pegasus app that has been widely kind of pushed back on here recently. If we think countries like Israel have that capability, we're certain countries like China have that capability to listen to phone calls, activate the camera, activate the microphone. So really the use cases are really endless.
What about these burner phones? Among others, the Washington Post has been reporting that journalists who are going to cover the games will be using phones that they only use in China and never use again, probably leave them there. This is not uncommon for journalists who are working in China, Russia, any number of countries that are known to be surveillance states. What impact do you think that might have? They can still get data from that burner phone, but presumably they wouldn't be able to connect those data to someone once they go back home.
That's right, Joshua. So in what it comes down to, though, is human behavior, right? So the burner phone, it's great. Journalists have been using them, as you know, for a long time. When I was a global executive at Defense Corporation, we used to advise our executives when they went to those countries to use burner phones, burner laptops, anything that you cared about, you would leave behind in the United States before you went to these countries. The problem is just human behavior, right? You're there for an extended period of time. You want to use your personal email. You want to get onto your social media apps. You want to communicate with your family, your loved ones, your colleagues back in the States. So the device itself is not the risk, but as you start to bring in the apps that you're used to using back in the United States or wherever you're traveling from, you open the ability in these kind of information highways that really China is just going to tap into. So even if you have a burner device, a burner phone, laptop, et cetera, and you leave it in the country, if you've used it to access any of your personal accounts or sensitive data, you should assume it's been compromised.
Before I have to let you go, I wonder what your sense is of whether or not this is just kind of the way of the world now. I mean, there are people who still post to TikTok not really concerned that the company that owns it, ByteDance, is a Chinese company. And I wonder if this is just kind of the expectation that sooner or later your digital devices are going to be surveilled. Maybe the U.S. government might do something similar when Chinese athletes are competing in the Olympics in Los Angeles coming up. I mean, is this just kind of the way of the world for us to get used to?
Well, I think it's two things, right? It's certainly the way of China. I think when it comes to surveillance and espionage, they lead the world. And then it's convenience, right? But as Americans, we love convenience. And so the idea of kind of leaving the comforts of home, either digitally or kind of in the physical world, isn't very appealing. So it may very well become the way of the world.
Eric Noonan of Cybersheath International, I appreciate you making time, sir. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you, Joshua.
And thank you for making time for us. Tomorrow night, we'll get into another bill to reshape classroom conversations. Some critics call it the Don't Say Gay bill. Have you heard of this? It would prevent public schools in Florida from encouraging, quote, classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity in primary grade levels, unquote. Again, this is in the state of Florida specifically. Now, we would love to hear from you about this proposal. Maybe you teach in a Florida public school, or maybe you have children that attend there, or maybe you just have questions and thoughts about these laws and these bills. However you want to get in touch, we are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also reach out to us directly by voicemail. The number is 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. What do you think of this so-called Don't Say Gay bill in Florida? You can also email us. The address is nowtonight@nbcnews.com. So until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for making time for us, and we'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.